It is August of the year 2000. In a quiet medical facility in New Hyde Park on Long Island, an elderly woman dies at the age of 88. There are no crowds gathered outside, no cameras wait at the entrance. Her death passes with little public notice, recorded briefly in newspapers before being forgotten almost entirely. At the time, her son is a prominent New York businessman, well known in real estate and tabloids, but not yet a political figure. The world does not pause. Her name was Mary Anne MacLeod Trump. Years later, her son would become one of the most recognizable and polarizing figures on the planet. His face would be broadcast daily across televisions, newspapers, and digital screens. His name would be debated, praised, and condemned in equal measure. Yet the woman who gave birth to him, who raised him through childhood, and who lived quietly alongside the construction of the Trump family fortune would remain largely absent from the public narrative. This absence is not accidental. History often remembers power, but rarely the figures who existed just outside it. Mothers, wives, and quiet partners to ambitious men tend to fade into the background, their lives flattened into footnotes or reduced to symbols. Mary Anne MacLeod Trump was not a public figure, nor did she seek to be one, but her life intersects with some of the most significant social movements of the 20th century: mass migration, class mobility, gendered power, and the transformation of America itself. To understand her story, it is necessary to look beyond the image of wealth and influence that would later surround the Trump name. Mary Anne's life began far from New York City, far from privilege, and far from power. It began in isolation. She was born in 1912 on the Isle of Lewis, part of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, a region known for its harsh climate, deep religious conservatism, and chronic poverty. Life there was governed by necessity. Opportunities were limited, and emigration was not an aspiration so much as an expectation. Entire generations left, not in pursuit of fortune, but in search of survival. For young women in particular, the choices were narrow: marriage, domestic labor, or departure. Remaining meant a life constrained by geography, tradition, and economic hardship. Leaving meant uncertainty, vulnerability, and the risk of anonymity in a foreign land. Mary Anne chose to leave. In 1930, at the age of 18, she boarded a ship bound for New York. She arrived not as a figure of ambition or entitlement, but as one of countless young immigrant women who entered the United States with little more than basic skills in the hope of finding work. Her stated occupation was domestic service. This was common. Domestic labor was one of the few avenues open to women without wealth or education, and it placed them inside the homes of strangers, dependent on their goodwill. New York, in the early 1930s, was not welcoming. The country was sliding into the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, wages low, and anti-immigrant sentiment was widespread. For someone like Mary Anne, anonymity was both protection and erasure. She existed on the margins of a city defined by speed and hierarchy, visible only when her labor was required. She would later meet Fred Trump, a rising real estate developer in Queens. Their marriage in 1936 marked a sharp change in her material circumstances, yet it did not elevate her into public life. Instead, it placed her inside a rigid, controlled household dominated by her husband's authority. Fred Trump was disciplined, austere, and intensely focused on business. The household he ran reflected those priorities. Mary Anne became a mother to 5 children. Her role was defined by domestic order, religious observance, and deference. She was not the architect of the family's business empire, nor was she positioned to challenge the structures around her. Her influence, such as it was, operated quietly, through routine, presence, and restraint. As the Trump name grew more prominent in New York, Mary Anne receded further from view. She did not give interviews. She did not cultivate a public persona. When her son Donald later emerged as a media figure, she appeared occasionally at formal events, smiling, reserved, almost invisible beside the spectacle. The contrast was striking. By the time of her death, the country she had immigrated to had changed beyond recognition. Immigration laws were stricter, the political climate more polarized. The story of who belonged in America was being contested loudly and often. Yet Mary Anne's own journey, from a remote Scottish island to the center of American wealth, was rarely acknowledged. Her life raises uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to build a dynasty on an immigrant foundation while later rejecting the language of immigration? How do power and silence coexist within families And how many lives like hers passed through history unnoticed, their significance revealed only in hindsight? Mary Anne MacLeod Trump did not shape policy. She did not command armies or corporations, but she lived through displacement, adaptation, and submission to structures larger than herself. Her story is not one of triumph in the conventional sense. It is a story of endurance, invisibility, and proximity to power without possession of it. To understand her life fully, one must begin where she did, in a place defined by scarcity, faith, and the quiet expectation that leaving was the only way forward. To understand the life of Mary Anne MacLeod Trump, it is necessary to understand the place that shaped her long before she ever saw America. The Isle of Lewis, where she was born in 1912, lay on the far northwestern edge of Scotland, exposed to the Atlantic and largely untouched by the industrial transformations that had reshaped much of Britain. Life there was austere, communal, and deeply conservative. The land was unforgiving, the climate harsh, and opportunities scarce. Mary Anne was born into a Gaelic-speaking family in the village of Tong, one of 10 children raised in a small crofting household. Crofting was not farming in the modern sense. It was subsistence living, small plots of land worked by hand, supplemented by fishing, seasonal labor, and whatever income could be scraped together. Wealth was virtually non-existent. Survival depended on cooperation, endurance, and adherence to rigid social norms. Religion dominated daily life. The Presbyterian Church shaped not only belief, but behavior, identity, and time itself. Sundays were strictly observed. Leisure was frowned upon. Silence, restraint, and obedience were virtues, particularly for women. Emotional expression was limited, and ambition was rarely encouraged. In such an environment, personal desires were secondary to duty. Education offered little escape. Schools were basic, resources limited, and expectations modest. For girls especially, formal education was rarely viewed as a pathway to independence. The assumption was that daughters would either marry locally or leave. Remaining on the island often meant a lifetime of domestic labor, dependency, and repetition. The early 20th century was a period of sustained emigration from the Outer Hebrides. Entire communities thinned as young people departed for the Scottish mainland, Canada, or the United States. This was not framed as abandonment, but as necessity. Letters from abroad described hardship, but also possibility. Money sent home sustained families who stayed behind. Leaving became a form of responsibility. Mary Anne grew up within this culture of departure. From an early age, she would have been aware that her future lay elsewhere. There was no expectation of transformation or reinvention. Emigration was not romanticized. It was simply understood as the only viable option for those who wished to avoid a life circumscribed by poverty and geography. Gender shaped every aspect of her upbringing. Women were expected to be industrious, compliant, and resilient. Authority flowed downward, from church elders, from fathers, from tradition. Questioning these structures carried social cost. Silence was a form of safety. Mary Anne learned this lesson well. Her family was not politically active in any conventional sense, but the island itself bore the legacy of marginalization. The Hebrides had long been neglected by central government, their residents treated as peripheral to the British state. This bred neither rebellion nor optimism, but resignation. Power existed elsewhere. Decisions were made elsewhere. One adapted or endured. By the late 1920s, the economic pressures intensified. The aftermath of the First World War and the approach of global depression further reduced opportunity. For Mary Anne, now in her mid-teens, the options were narrowing. Domestic service abroad offered a rare chance at wages, independence, and movement, however limited. It was a path followed by many young women before her. Leaving the Isle of Lewis was not an act of rebellion. It was a continuation of a pattern deeply embedded in island life. What made it significant was not the act itself, but the destination. America represented distance not only in geography, but in social possibility. Yet it also represented vulnerability. Young women traveling alone occupied the lowest rungs of the social ladder upon arrival. When Mary Anne prepared to leave in 1930, she carried little with her. There was no inheritance, no network of influence, no assurance of success. She left behind family, language, and certainty. What awaited her was anonymity. The ship that carried her to New York crossed more than an ocean. It carried her from a world governed by tradition and scarcity into one governed by hierarchy and speed. The discipline she had learned on the Isle of Lewis, obedience, restraint, endurance, would serve her, but it would not elevate her. Those qualities were useful to employers, not to society. Her childhood had not prepared her for visibility or power. It had prepared her to survive quietly. This background matters because it shaped the choices she would later make and the roles she would accept. Mary Anne did not arrive in America seeking influence or transformation. She arrived seeking work, stability, safety. The lessons of the island followed her across the Atlantic. Keep order, avoid conflict, endure. These lessons would later be mirrored in the household she entered through marriage, where authority flowed in a single direction and obedience was rewarded. The continuity is striking. What changed were the surroundings, not the structure. By the time Mary Anne boarded the ship for New York, she was already formed by a world that valued silence over assertion and endurance over ambition. That formation would remain with her for the rest of her life. America would give her distance from poverty. It would not give her voice. When Mary Anne MacLeod Trump arrived in New York Harbor in 1930, the city she entered bore little resemblance to the place celebrated in postcards and promotional brochures. The optimism of the 1920s had evaporated. The stock market crash of the previous year had pushed the United States into the early stages of the Great Depression, and unemployment was rising rapidly. For immigrants arriving with little money and no influential connections, the timing could hardly have been worse. Mary Anne was 18 years old. She spoke English with a thick Gaelic-inflected Scottish accent and had no formal training beyond domestic skills learned at home. Like many young women from the Outer Hebrides, she entered the country under a temporary visa intended for domestic workers. This was a common pathway for women whose labor was in demand, but whose presence was not encouraged beyond its utility. Domestic service in early 20th century America occupied an ambiguous position. It offered steady work and shelter, but little security or dignity. Live-in maids were expected to be discreet, compliant, and invisible. Their lives were defined by the routines of other households. Privacy was minimal. Power imbalances were absolute. For immigrant women, the job offered survival, not advancement. Mary Anne found work as a maid in New York, likely moving between households as employment shifted. Records from the period are sparse, and her own voice is almost entirely absent from the historical record. What can be inferred comes from context rather than testimony. Long hours, low pay, and social isolation were typical. Employers often viewed domestic workers as interchangeable, their personal histories irrelevant. For someone raised in the rigid, hierarchical world of the Isle of Lewis, the transition was not as jarring as it might have been for others. She was accustomed to authority, accustomed to restraint, accustomed to subsuming herself within larger structures. What changed was the scale. In New York, anonymity replaced familiarity. No one knew her family. No one shared her past. She existed solely as labor. Immigrant communities offered some degree of support, but Mary Anne's background set her apart. Scottish immigrants were fewer in number than Irish or Italian arrivals, and lacked the dense urban networks that provided protection and opportunity. Moreover, domestic workers often lived inside their employers' homes, limiting contact with peers. Isolation was structural. The early 1930s were marked by suspicion toward immigrants. Jobs were scarce, and newcomers were often blamed for economic hardship. Immigration laws tightened, reflecting a broader shift toward restriction and exclusion. Mary Anne's legal status was precarious. Domestic workers were tolerated so long as they remained useful. Permanence was not guaranteed. At some point in the early 1930s, Mary Anne returned briefly to Scotland. The reasons are unclear. It may have been to renew her visa, to attend to family matters, or to reassess her prospects. What is clear is that she chose to return to the United States. This decision suggests that whatever hardships she faced in New York, the alternatives at home remained more limited. When she came back to America, she did so with the intention of staying. In 1936, she married Fred Trump, a real estate developer whose fortunes were beginning to rise. The marriage marked a profound shift in her circumstances. Financial insecurity gave way to material comfort. Yet the power dynamics of her life did not fundamentally change. Marriage did not elevate Mary Anne into public life. It repositioned her within a different hierarchy. Fred Trump was disciplined, controlling, and deeply invested in order and reputation. The household he ran mirrored his business practices. Precision, obedience, and discipline were central values. Mary Anne's role within this environment was domestic, supportive, and deferential. Her immigrant past did not disappear, but it was absorbed. She became a wife and mother within a rapidly ascending family, yet she did not assume an independent identity. Her accent reportedly softened over time. Her public presence diminished. The qualities that had allowed her to survive as an immigrant, quiet endurance, adaptability, restraint, now defined her place within wealth. In 1942, Mary Anne became a naturalized American citizen. By then, she had lived in the United States for over a decade. The ceremony formalized her belonging, but it did not alter her visibility. She remained outside the spotlight, her life defined by family and routine rather than public ambition. It is notable how little evidence remains of her inner life during these years. She left no memoirs, gave no extended interviews, and rarely appeared independently in media. This absence is itself revealing. Immigrant women in domestic roles were rarely encouraged to record their experiences. Their stories were considered private, marginal, or irrelevant to broader narratives of success. Yet, Mary Anne's journey encapsulates a central paradox of American immigration. She moved from extreme poverty to extraordinary wealth, but she did so without acquiring voice or authority. Her mobility was material, not social. She crossed borders and classes, but she did not cross into power. By the mid-1930s, her immigrant journey was effectively complete. She had secured stability, legal status, and family. What followed was a life lived alongside ambition, rather than within it. The choices she made as a young immigrant, silence, adaptation, endurance, would shape not only her own trajectory, but the household in which her children were raised. America had given her refuge. It had not given her prominence. When Mary Anne MacLeod Trump married Fred Trump in January 1936, the union marked a decisive break from the precarious life she had known as a domestic worker. Material insecurity receded almost immediately. The world she entered was ordered, prosperous, and governed by rules that differed sharply from those of the immigrant households in which she had previously worked. Yet, if the circumstances of her life changed dramatically, the balance of power within it did not. Fred Trump was already a disciplined and ambitious man. He had built his early career through careful expansion, leveraging modest housing projects in Queens and Brooklyn during a period of rapid urban growth. He was methodical, conservative in temperament, and intensely focused on control of finances, of time, and of people. These traits would define not only his business practices, but his household as well. Mary Anne's role within this new environment was clearly delineated. She was not expected to participate in business decisions, nor to cultivate a public profile. Her responsibilities were domestic and symbolic, maintaining order in the home, raising children, and embodying respectability. Wealth did not translate into independence. It brought structure, expectation, and scrutiny. The Trump household operated according to strict routines. Discipline was valued, rules were enforced, emotional expression was limited. Fred Trump believed deeply in order and hierarchy, and he applied these principles consistently. Mary Anne adapted to this system with the same restraint that had guided her earlier life. Compliance was not presented as submission, but as propriety. In the years following their marriage, the couple began a family. Their first child, Mary Anne, was born in 1937, followed by Fred Jr. in 1938. 2 daughters and another son would follow in the years after the Second World War. Motherhood anchored Mary Anne's identity. It provided purpose, but it also confined her further to the private sphere. Accounts from those who later observed the family suggest that Fred Trump exercised dominant authority within the household. He set standards and expected them to be met. Discipline extended to table manners, schedules, and behavior. Mary Anne's role was supportive rather than directive. She enforced rules rather than created them. In this arrangement, she functioned as an intermediary, buffering children from severity while upholding the structure imposed from above. Her background made her well-suited to this position. Raised in a culture that valued obedience and restraint, she didn't openly challenge authority. Silence once again served as protection. The skills that had enabled her to survive poverty and immigration, adaptation, emotional control, endurance, now ensured stability within wealth. The contrast between her public invisibility and the expanding Trump fortune was striking. As Fred Trump's projects multiplied and his reputation grew within New York's real estate circles, Mary Anne remained absent from professional life. She appeared occasionally at formal events, but rarely spoke publicly. Her presence was supportive, never central. This pattern reflected broader norms of the era. Mid-20th century American society, particularly among upwardly mobile families, often confined women to domestic roles regardless of their intelligence or experience. Yet, Mary Anne's case carried an added layer. As an immigrant woman with limited formal education, her authority was further constrained. Deference was not only expected, it was assumed. During the Second World War, as Fred Trump expanded his business through government-funded housing projects, the household's material security increased further. The family moved into larger homes. Comfort replaced austerity, yet the internal structure of the family remained rigid. Wealth did not soften discipline. If anything, it reinforced it. Mary Anne did not withdraw from responsibility. She managed the household meticulously. Religion remained part of daily life, reflecting her upbringing. Order and routine shaped the children's environment. In this sense, she was deeply influential, though her influence was indirect. She shaped the emotional climate without shaping policy. Observers have noted that within the Trump household, affection was expressed sparingly. Praise was conditional. Expectations were high. Mary Anne navigated this environment carefully, offering quiet support rather than overt challenge. Her authority derived from constancy rather than command. It's difficult to determine how she perceived her position. The historical record provides little insight into her private thoughts. What can be said is that she did not seek escape or reinvention. She did not return to public work. She did not assert independence through visibility. Instead, she occupied the space available to her and fulfilled its demands with consistency. Marriage had lifted her from vulnerability, but it had also locked her into a structure defined by someone else's ambitions. This was not unique to her, but it was pronounced. The household she helped maintain was one in which power flowed decisively in a single direction. As the years progressed, Mary Anne's life settled into routine. Children grew. The business expanded. Public recognition accrued to Fred Trump alone. She remained present but peripheral, essential but unseen. The contrast between her origins and her surroundings widened, yet she did not cross into authority. By the end of the 1940s, Mary Anne had secured everything immigration had promised her: safety, stability, and prosperity. What it hadn't promised, voice, autonomy, or recognition, remained out of reach. Her life was comfortable, ordered, and constrained. The woman who had once crossed an ocean alone now lived at the center of a growing empire. But the empire was not hers. By the early 1950s, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump had settled fully into the role that would define most of her adult life. She was no longer an immigrant struggling for footing, nor a newly married woman adjusting to wealth. She was a mother presiding over a household shaped by discipline, hierarchy, and ambition, an environment carefully designed and tightly controlled by her husband. The Trump home was not chaotic. It was ordered. Schedules were observed. Rules were enforced. Expectations were clear. Fred Trump believed that character was forged through structure and pressure, not indulgence. He viewed softness as weakness and regarded discipline as preparation for competition. This philosophy governed both his business dealings and his parenting. Mary Anne operated within this framework rather than outside it. Her authority did not challenge Fred's. It complemented it. She ensured routines were followed, appearances maintained, and standards upheld. Where Fred imposed rules, Mary Anne implemented them. Where Fred withdrew emotionally, she provided steadiness. This division of roles was not explicitly articulated, but it was understood. The children grew up in a household where approval was conditional and achievement emphasized. Praise was measured, failure was noted. Emotional expression was limited, particularly for the boys. Mary Anne's role was not to soften the structure, but to make it livable. She provided consistency in a system that offered little room for vulnerability. Religion remained present, reflecting her upbringing. Church attendance and moral discipline were part of daily life. Yet faith was less about spiritual exploration than about order and restraint. It reinforced obedience rather than introspection. In this environment, Mary Anne's quiet demeanor aligned seamlessly with the household's values. As the children grew older, differences in temperament became apparent. Mary Anne responded to these differences cautiously. She did not openly favor one child over another, but she adapted her approach subtly. Her influence was personal rather than ideological. She offered reassurance when possible, though always within the limits imposed by the household's culture. Fred Trump's authority remained unchallenged. He expected reports on behavior and performance. Discipline was sometimes physical. Mary Anne did not publicly oppose this. Whether she privately disagreed is unknown. What is clear is that she did not disrupt the structure. Stability, once again, took precedence over confrontation. This pattern of maternal restraint is central to understanding her life. Mary Anne was not powerless in an absolute sense. She managed the household. She shaped daily routines. She provided emotional continuity, yet her power was circumscribed. It operated within boundaries she did not set. As the family's wealth increased, so did expectations. The children were raised with a sense of entitlement to success, but not to comfort. Competition was encouraged. Weakness was discouraged. Mary Anne ensured that the household presented an image of respectability and order consistent with Fred Trump's public persona. She did not cultivate a separate identity outside the family. Unlike some women of comparable wealth, she did not become a public philanthropist or social figure in her own right. Her charitable activities, when they occurred, were quiet and often aligned with causes supported by her husband. Visibility was not sought. This absence of public presence was not necessarily imposed. It reflected a lifetime of adaptation to systems where discretion was rewarded. From the Isle of Lewis to New York domestic service to a controlled household, Mary Anne learned that visibility carried risk. Remaining unobtrusive ensured survival. Her children absorbed these dynamics differently. Some thrived within structure, others struggled. Mary Anne's responses were consistent. Support without defiance, care without challenge. She offered stability, not opposition. In doing so, she reinforced the system even as she softened its edges. The cost of this arrangement was subtle but enduring. Emotional intimacy was limited. Individual expression was constrained. The household functioned efficiently, but it did not invite reflection. Mary Anne did not create this environment, but she sustained it. By the end of the 1950s, the Trump family was firmly established within New York's upper-middle-class world. Their future appeared secure. Mary Anne's role within that future was clear. She would remain the steady presence behind the structure, essential, reliable, and largely unseen. Motherhood, for Mary Anne, was not a platform for influence beyond the home. It was a responsibility carried out with discipline and restraint. Her impact was real, but indirect. She shaped lives without shaping direction. This pattern would continue as her children moved toward adulthood. The household she helped maintain would leave lasting impressions, not only on family dynamics, but on the personalities that emerged from it. The mother at the center of the home remained constant. The world around her moved forward. By the early 1960s, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump had entered a quieter phase of life, even as the household she helped sustain moved into a more demanding one. Her children were no longer small. They were adolescents and young adults, beginning to test the boundaries set for them. The home remained ordered and disciplined, but its center of gravity shifted as ambition and competition intensified. Fred Trump's expectations sharpened during these years. He viewed adolescence not as a period for exploration, but as preparation for adult struggle. Success was framed as obligation. Failure was treated as weakness. The household's emotional economy grew more austere, particularly for the sons. Mary Anne continued to occupy her familiar position, supportive, attentive, and cautious. But the limits of her influence became increasingly clear. She didn't shape the direction of the family's ambitions. That authority remained firmly with her husband. What she provided was continuity. Meals were regular. Appearances were maintained. The household functioned smoothly. In a family where emotional expression was constrained, consistency became her primary contribution. The children responded differently to this environment. Some adapted easily. Others struggled under the weight of expectation. Mary Anne's responses were subtle rather than confrontational. She offered reassurance in private, encouragement when possible, and quiet sympathy when disappointment arose. Yet she did not openly challenge the system that produced these pressures. Her background offers context for this restraint. Mary Anne had grown up in a world where authority was rarely questioned and where survival depended on compliance. She had learned early that opposition carried consequences. This lesson followed her into wealth. Silence was not merely habit, it was strategy. During this period, the Trump household experienced internal strain. One of the sons, Fred Trump Jr., found it increasingly difficult to meet his father's expectations. His interests lay outside the family business, and his temperament clashed with the rigid discipline imposed upon him. Mary Anne was aware of this tension. She could not resolve it. Her influence, while present, did not extend to altering the family's hierarchy. Fred Trump's authority was absolute. Decisions were not negotiated. Mary Anne's role was to absorb the emotional fallout. not to redirect its source. At the same time, the wider world was changing rapidly. The 1960s brought cultural upheaval, challenges to authority, and shifting social norms. These changes barely penetrated the Trump household. The family remained insulated, conservative, and focused inward. Mary Anne did not act as a conduit for these external currents. Her instincts favored stability over adaptation. As her sons approached adulthood, the division between maternal presence and paternal power became more pronounced. Mary Anne continued to offer constancy, but she did not advocate publicly or privately for alternative paths. Whether this reflected agreement, resignation, or caution is difficult to determine. What is clear is that she did not disrupt the existing order. This restraint should not be mistaken for indifference. Mary Anne remained deeply invested in her children's well-being, yet her care was expressed through maintenance rather than intervention. She ensured the household remained intact, even as internal pressures mounted. By the late 1960s, the family business was expanding further, and Fred Trump began grooming a successor. This process unfolded largely outside Mary Anne's sphere. Strategic decisions were made between father and son. She was not included. Her role remained domestic, supportive, and peripheral. This marginalization was not sudden. It was the culmination of a lifetime of adaptation to structures that rewarded invisibility. Mary Anne had never been positioned as a decision-maker. She had never been encouraged to assert authority beyond the home. Her silence was not imposed. It was normalized. As the children left home and entered adult life, Mary Anne's daily responsibilities diminished. The routines she had managed for decades became less central. The household remained ordered, but quieter. Her presence became less visible even within the family itself. These years marked a transition. The mother who had once managed the rhythms of a busy household now watched from the margins as adult ambitions unfolded. Her influence persisted, but it was residual rather than directive. She shaped character through example rather than instruction. By the early 1970s, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump occupied a paradoxical position. She lived at the center of wealth and ambition, yet remained largely detached from its mechanisms. She was respected but not consulted, present but not decisive. This pattern, proximity without power, had defined her life from the beginning. Immigration had brought her stability, marriage had brought her comfort, motherhood had given her purpose, none had given her authority. As the family moved toward a new phase of prominence, Mary Anne receded further from view. The public story of the Trump family would soon focus on other figures, other voices. Hers would remain largely unheard. The limits of her influence were not failures of character. They were the product of a lifetime spent navigating structures that valued endurance over assertion. She had survived by adapting. That adaptation carried a cost. What followed would deepen that withdrawal. By the mid-1970s, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump had largely withdrawn from the active rhythms that had defined her earlier adulthood. Her children were grown. The household she had once managed with precision no longer required constant supervision. The center of family life shifted outward, toward business offices, public projects, and increasingly visible ambition. Mary Anne remained present, but she was no longer central. This withdrawal was gradual rather than deliberate. It reflected both age and circumstance. As Fred Trump delegated more responsibility to his sons, particularly Donald, family life became more fragmented. Decisions were made elsewhere. The home, once a site of daily structure and authority, became symbolic rather than operational. Mary Anne's role, always quiet, became quieter still. Her health began to decline during these years. Accounts indicate that she suffered from osteoporosis and other age-related conditions that limited her mobility and independence. In later life, she would also experience cognitive decline. These changes were not sudden, but cumulative. They further reduced her public presence and reinforced her retreat into privacy. Wealth insulated her from material hardship, but it did not restore autonomy. Medical care was available, comfort was maintained, yet illness narrowed her world. The routines she had relied upon for decades fell away. What remained was observation rather than participation. During this period, the Trump family's public profile expanded dramatically. Donald Trump emerged as a media figure, cultivating visibility and controversy. His name became synonymous with spectacle, ambition, and confrontation. Mary Anne appeared occasionally at formal events, often photographed beside her husband or son, but she rarely spoke. Her demeanor was reserved, composed, and distant from the performance unfolding around her. The contrast was striking. A woman shaped by silence and restraint now existed at the edge of a family narrative defined by volume and assertion. She did not intervene. She did not comment publicly. Her presence remained symbolic rather than active. Family dynamics during these years were marked by strain. The death of her son, Fred Jr., in 1981, following years of personal struggle, cast a long shadow. Mary Anne was reportedly deeply affected. Yet grief, like other emotions in her life, was contained rather than displayed. The family moved forward. Public narratives continued. Loss was absorbed quietly. As Fred Trump aged, Mary Anne's position within the family became more ambiguous. She was respected, but increasingly peripheral. Decisions about business, property, and legacy unfolded largely without her involvement. The structures that had once defined her role no longer required her presence. In the 1990s, as Fred Trump's health declined, Mary Anne's own vulnerabilities deepened. Cognitive impairment limited her engagement with the world around her. The woman who had spent a lifetime managing order now required care herself. This reversal was handled privately, shielded from public scrutiny. She lived her final years largely out of view, attended by family and medical professionals. There were no interviews, no reflections, no attempt to frame her life for posterity. Her story remained internal, known only to those closest to her. Mary Anne died in August 2000 at the age of 88. Her death received minimal attention. Obituaries were brief. The moment passed quietly. At the time, there was no reason for broader notice. Her son's political career had not yet begun. The Trump name, while prominent in business and media, had not yet become a global fixation. This quiet ending was consistent with the life she had lived. Mary Anne had never occupied the foreground. She had existed alongside power without exercising it, within wealth without controlling it, and at the heart of a family whose public story did not include her voice. Her withdrawal was not a rejection of the world, but a continuation of a pattern established early in life. From the Isle of Lewis to New York domestic service to a controlled household, Mary Anne had learned that visibility invited risk. Survival lay in restraint. Illness stripped away even the limited roles she had maintained. What remained was presence without agency, observation without intervention, endurance without recognition. In death, as in life, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump didn't demand attention. She left no manifesto, no public reckoning, no definitive account of her experiences. The record is fragmentary, shaped by absence as much as by fact. Yet that absence is itself revealing. It speaks to the countless lives that intersect with power without shaping it, that sustain families and systems without receiving acknowledgement. Mary Anne's life was not extraordinary because of fame or achievement. It was extraordinary because of how completely it disappeared into the structures around it. The story did not end with her death. The consequences of the household she helped sustain, the values she reinforced through endurance rather than assertion, continued to unfold. The public narrative would soon shift dramatically, casting new light backward onto a life long finished. What remained was legacy, unspoken, indirect, and unresolved. When historians attempt to assess the lives that orbit power, they often encounter a problem of evidence. The most influential figures leave speeches, letters, memoirs, and public records. Those who stand beside them, particularly women, often leave very little. Mary Anne MacLeod Trump belongs to this second category. Her legacy is not documented through words, but through absence. After her death in 2000, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump quickly receded from public memory. There were no extended obituaries, no retrospectives, no reassessments of her life. At the time, there was little reason for them. She had not held office, led institutions, or spoken publicly about her experiences. She was remembered, if at all, as a background figure, a wife, a mother, a quiet presence at family events. That changed years later when her son rose to the highest political office in the United States and became a global figure of controversy. As attention turned backward toward the origins of the Trump family, Mary Anne's life began to attract renewed scrutiny, yet even then the focus was narrow. She was referenced primarily as an immigrant, a biographical fact rather than a subject in her own right. This reduction is revealing. Mary Anne's story is often invoked symbolically, stripped of its human complexity. She is cited to illustrate irony, contradiction, or lineage, but rarely examined on her own terms. The details of her life, poverty, migration, domestic labor, constraint, are compressed into a single label: immigrant, mother, peripheral. Yet immigration, in her case, was not an abstract identity. It was a lived experience shaped by vulnerability and limitation. She arrived in America alone, young and economically exposed. She worked in domestic service, a sector defined by invisibility and dependence. Her legal status was conditional. Her prospects were narrow. Survival required adaptability rather than ambition. The distance between that reality and the wealth she later lived alongside is striking. Mary Anne moved across borders and classes, but she did so without acquiring public authority or voice. Her mobility was structural, not personal. It depended on marriage, not recognition. In this sense, her life reflects a broader pattern in 20th century migration, particularly for women. Opportunity existed, but it was mediated through systems that rewarded compliance more than assertion. Mary Anne did not challenge those systems. She adapted to them. This adaptation should not be mistaken for passivity. It required discipline, restraint, and endurance over decades. From the Isle of Lewis to New York, from domestic labor to wealth, she navigated environments governed by hierarchy and expectation. In each, she learned the same lesson. Stability was achieved through silence. Her silence has consequences for how her legacy is understood. Without her own account, interpretation fills the gap. Some portray her as gentle and nurturing. Others suggest emotional distance. Still others project symbolic meaning onto her immigrant status. None of these interpretations can be fully substantiated. They reveal more about contemporary concerns than about her inner life. What can be said with confidence is that Mary Anne did not shape power directly. She did not design institutions or strategies. She did not intervene publicly in family decisions or ambitions. Yet she existed at the center of a household that produced significant influence. Her role was supportive, stabilizing, and sustaining. This kind of influence is difficult to measure. It does not leave clear markers. It operates through routine, presence, and continuity. It reinforces structures rather than altering them. Mary Anne's legacy lies not in transformation, but in maintenance. That maintenance mattered. The household she helped sustain was disciplined, ordered, and hierarchical. Those qualities shaped the people raised within it. Her influence was not decisive, but it was constant. She did not redirect power, but she normalized its environment. Her life also exposes a tension at the heart of American narratives. Immigration is often celebrated as a story of upward mobility and self-creation. Mary Anne's experience complicates that story. She achieved security and comfort, but not autonomy. Her success was real, but it was bounded. It depended on adapting to existing power rather than reshaping it. In this sense, her story is neither triumphant nor tragic. It is illustrative. It shows how systems absorb individuals, how endurance can coexist with erasure, and how proximity to power does not guarantee agency. Mary Anne lived a life defined by movement without voice and comfort without control. As history continues to debate the legacy of the Trump family, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump remains an elusive figure. She's often referenced, rarely examined. Her life resists simplification. It does not fit neatly into narratives of empowerment or oppression. It occupies a quieter space. That quiet matters. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who speak loudly or act decisively. It is also shaped by those who sustain environments, reinforce norms, and endure structures without acknowledgement. Their influence is indirect but real. Mary Anne did not seek recognition, and she did not receive it. Her life ended as it had largely been lived, out of view. Yet the forces she navigated, the choices she made within constraint, and the silence she maintained offer insight into the human cost of power and ambition. In the end, Mary Anne MacLeod Trump was not a symbol. She was a person shaped by place, circumstance, and limitation. Her legacy is not written in monuments or speeches, but in the spaces she occupied and the structures she endured. That may be the most honest way to remember her.